Mao Zedong to this day is still regarded very highly in China, which begs the question why. With many other authoritarian governments, they have long since been scorned by their own countries and even banned. By asking why he was able to stay in power for so long can help us answer why he is still loved to this day. So Mao's reform of China had actually brought them out of many severe crises. So for example, when Mao came to power, a woman's social position was so low that it was commonplace for a 13-year-old girl to be sold as someone's third concubine for only $100. Mao outlawed concubinage and made it law so that women were equal to men. He then forced all the young girls to go to school and be educated as well as boys. When Mao came to power, 80% of the Chinese population was illiterate. The definition of literacy was the ability to write one's own name. The common form of identification in China then was to dip one's finger in red ink and make a thumbprint because the vast majority of the people didn't know how to write their own names. The CCP would set up night schools and make everyone under the age of 40 go there after work to learn how to read and write, and within a decade, the tide of illiteracy in cities and towns receded. Mao was best known for two revolutionary movements known as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. The Great Leap Forward aimed to rapidly transform the country from an agriculture-based economy to a socialist society through industrialization. Private farming was prohibited, and those engaged in it were persecuted and labeled counter-revolutionaries. The Great Leap Forward planned to develop agriculture and industry. Mao believed that both had to be grown to allow for the other to grow. Industry could only prosper if the workforce was well fed, while agricultural workers needed industry to produce the modern tools needed for growth. To allow for this, China was reformed into a series of communes. Communes were groups that people belonged to. People in a commune gave up their ownership of tools and animals so that everything was owned by the commune. Communes also provided different institutions all aimed at reducing the amount of people staying at home to look after family members and instead sending them to work. This included daycares and nursing homes for the elderly. However, as a movement started to fail on part of the famine that left anywhere to 40 million Chinese peasants dead, this would cause him to resign due to pressure from his own party members, but he would still remain popular among the middle class as he would before. This would ultimately lead to the Cultural Revolution. In response to the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao would start the Cultural Revolution aimed at reasserting his authority and eliminating more political opponents. This would be a much more radical movement than the Great Leap Forward. Mao would begin the proletarian Cultural Revolution to remove the country of quote-unquote representatives of the bourgeoisie who have sneaked into the party, the government, the army, and various spheres of culture, and destroy the four olds: old ideas, old customs, old culture, and old habits. To aid in the Cultural Revolution, Mao targeted the young people of the nation to revive China's spirit that had faded since the end of the Civil War. Mao immediately began to shut down schools and called for the youth to bring China back to the glorious years after the Civil War. This would lead to the formation of the Red Guards. Mao had groups of cults, the most famous being the Red Guard, formed to hunt down those who opposed him. They viewed Mao as their god with obsessive behaviors such as bowing and picture saluting. They were entirely devoted to spreading the Little Red Book, destroying non-Marxist books, and preventing people from reading anything else. From 1966 to 1976, books by Confucius, Chiang Kai-shek, and Sun Yat-sen, as well as Western classics such as Shakespeare, were banned by the Chinese government. These were perceived as threats to Mao and his national campaign. Every Chinese person, regardless of status, was forced to read, memorize, and praise Mao's quote-unquote gospel. It contained 427 famous quotes from Mao, from speeches about education to Western ideologies. From 1964 to 1976, there were over 6 billion copies printed, making it one of the most printed books in human history. It was simply more than a propaganda device. It was hailed as the Bible and exemplified the way to live for every Chinese person. Those who refused to read the book were labeled as traitors or capitalists, and thus persecuted by the government. During the height of the revolution, Mao encouraged the masses to destroy any materials that were contrary to his beliefs. Books that challenged the legitimacy of the communist regime were burned, and libraries closed down to prevent their volumes from being confiscated. Any libraries that remained open were then filled with Little Red books and propaganda material. The denial of the right to read non-Maoist books led to the formation of black markets specializing in the distribution of books. Those who challenged the censorship law were persecuted by the government, or more often the Red Guards. The government even encouraged and approved house and library raiding by the guards. Although most books were burned, some were sold and resold at black markets. Underground reading groups formed because the constant exposure to Maoism. The people began to be interested in foreign literature and what life was like outside of Mao's China. Mao's media propaganda was heavily based on Lenin's model, used as a tool of quote-unquote mass agitation and organization, end quote. Political campaigns would begin in editorials of the lead newspapers and smaller prints would follow. The majority of Mao's propaganda could be found in the forced reciting of the Little Red Book. A combination of his speeches and ideals would be heard every single day. The army would become essential in coercing the Chinese population to live by the Little Red Book. Mao's propaganda was largely based on making him look larger than life. In most posters, he would be seen in the foreground in the sky like a god, with people below smiling up towards him. To this day, a picture of Mao still hangs in Tiananmen Square.